Hello, welcome everybody. Let's see if we get a couple more people, a lot of people rolling in. All right, Kyle and Adrian, you guys ready to go?
Oh yeah.
Perfect. All right, well, thanks everybody. Welcome to our final part of the SASE Webinar Series. Today we're going to be tying it all together with how to make the business case. So, the feedback and reception on our first two parts has been really great. And so I'm looking forward to today. I think Kyle's going to get us started. And yeah, guys, take it away.
Thanks, Josh. Man, the production value on these things is really going through the roof, Josh. The intro music, I love it.
Really sets the stage.
Yeah, thank you. Feel like I got to live up to something though now. So I guess let's get into it. I mean, look, what we're going to be talking about today is really the business case and ROI modeling behind SASE as a technology. Specifically, so obviously this is the third in a three-part series, but it is a technology that reaches across domains, and so it ended up being a business case with a lot of consideration. So we're excited to get into it. A little bit about us. So, Resourcive, where we see ourselves as the premier value creation partner for mid-market and enterprise organizations. And what we really focus on is, identifying, quantifying, building business cases around high impact technologies, verifying that the ROI is there and ensuring that those things are implemented. So we've been doing that across, technology kind of verticals for quite a while. And one of the ones we brought on last year and started focusing in was our cybersecurity practice. And so we brought in a cyber practice lead with Adrian, and he's joining us today to talk about that with SASE. Adrian, you want to do an introduction?
Yeah. So I've got a little bit of experience, computer science background, and have written software, and so I've been in the software development space for a little while, and specifically in cybersecurity software development, and have done some consulting and came on board here really to help find the best outcomes for our customers. So I do come from a technical background, so we're really using that technical experience to better advise people instead of just using and believing the market the vendor marketing that comes out of some of these companies. So hopefully we can help out.
Cool. Thanks, Adrian. So I already alluded to kind of where we're at in this series. This is the third and final part in a three-part series. So we started back in December with really an overview to what is SASE. We'll do a quick grounding in that, just a quick concept review there, but basically, an overview of what it entails, some of the different approaches to implementing it in companies, some of the different approaches even vendors that are taking to this market. And then in the second part, we really went deep. I didn't talk nearly as much in that one. That was Adrian's show really, and went into some of the more in-depth technology considerations. So today what we're looking to do is really pull that together and have an overview on, okay, you kind of understand what technology is, you understand where it can be impactful for you. Now, how do we go about, considering where we're at today, which version of this we would like to consume and move towards, and actually, put some of the dollars and cents behind it and see where it makes sense and what some of the impacts you can expect in your company are. So that's a lot of what we'll be talking about today. Before we get into those details, though, just a little bit of like why we see it as important, why we're talking about it. Gartner's saying 40% of enterprises will have strategies to adopt SASE by next year. And every time I see this number, it's revised upward.
Absolutely.
A lot of kind of tailwinds to this, for all the reasons we talked about in the previous portions of this series. But also, a lot of IT leaders we talk to, they don't necessarily have a great understanding of where the specific impact's going to be. Many of them gravitate towards like understanding the technology. They can even understand how it will like make a change in their leadership of their department. When they think about their staff and like that sort of stuff, they're pretty good there. But like understanding the impacts in the other areas and then how to solution the whole thing together, because you're changing the budgetary model often from a CapEx to an OpEx. You're changing the network underlay, you're changing the edge, and that is interacting with where you're moving all your applications and where all your users are moving. So it's this very kind of complex picture with, you know, a lot of tentacles. So it's something that people struggle to understand. You know, and our core position is we don't really see this as a kind of if it will happen sort of thing. It is going to happen in some way, shape, or form to, you know, any businesses that are running corporate networks.
Yeah, and you know, Kyle, we've talked like in the past, and I've talked to customers about SASE, you know, the overall concept, and it doesn't have to be a full implementation of all of the core components, and that's kind of the key piece of this that we've been trying to hit on is this framework can really be used to augment your existing network and security stacks, and kind of reduce some of that overhead that you may have with maintenance, and we'll get into all those considerations.
Yeah, I mean, it creates a real challenge, and like, you know, you can create these business cases holistically. You can create them in part. You can create them holistically and then say, okay, like, well, what's the route where we actually go to get there? You know, so, and you can take an equal amount of approaches to implementation, right? I mean, you can do it. There's a lot of variables in this. So, yeah, I'm going to talk through some of that today. All right. But Adrian, can you ground us again? What is SASE? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, so we've definitely beaten this to death, I think, over the last 2 webinars. So I will be quick. This is my only kind of review slide. But really, Secure Access Service Edge is SASE. Secure Service Edge is SSE, and they are Gartner categories or frameworks that really are discussing taking network capabilities and security capabilities and putting them together into some type of core offering that is moved to the cloud. There are some like important components of that, mostly being the cloud piece. And those core bits are software defined wide area network, which is kind of giving you a software based controller on how to steer and shape, prioritize traffic around that WAN edge. Secure Web Gateway, which is screening and filtering of web application traffic for your users. Cloud Access Security Broker, which is an intermediary broker between the users and the actual web applications that they're going to be using, and Zero Trust Network Access, which is again kind of a framework on how you should establish controls around user roles, and not really just limited to users, but actual services themselves, and only allowing different pieces to access the things that it needs to do its role or specific job. And then the next gen firewall. And we won't get into that too much because I think everybody's generally familiar with next gen firewalls, but we're pushing that capability to the cloud. At the end of the day, the business case here, and something that we haven't really discussed even in webinar number 2, is that the real benefits can be linked and become a lot more compelling if you're also integrating these SASE core components with a vendor that has some of the ancillary benefits. Like specifically, a great use case of this is if you are already running an online web store and you have a very in-depth Cloudflare or Akamai kind of CDN or other capabilities, the really application kind of enhancing for traffic across the world, then it may make sense for you to integrate some of those Zero Trust Network Access and like CASB and Secure Web Gateway that those vendors are offering, because you're already integrated in that. And so that's a real big consideration when we start moving forward into this business case scenario.
Cool. Thanks. And I think the other thing is, right, I mean, so this is really intercepting a lot of areas of the business. So sometimes what I like to ground in before we even talk any tech is just like, what are kind of broad categories where these things will be impacted in some way, shape, or form, and I need to be considering them as I'm evaluating. So, you know, before we're ever even talking about any of the bits or bytes. And so I often start in my thinking about this at point solutions, right? And the reason I start there is oftentimes they're the things that, you know, kind of indicate, hey, it may be like, this may start us on a trajectory towards towards SASE anyways, right? So things like issues with the network edge. So the network edge is going to be impacted in some way, shape, or form. Whether it's routers that are currently provided and managed by carriers, or even switching all the way up to APs and what you have deployed, and sometimes even in the management model of those. I mean, I've had conversations with clients where one of the things we ultimately impacted was the third-party management contract that they had on all the AP devices across all these locations. So, I mean, there's like that whole area can be impacted by this. There's also firewalls. So a lot of times you see that as an entry point towards SASE, where firewalls are end of life, or they're not delivering a functionality, that the business is seeking. Also VPNs. I think that's probably another very, very common entry point, especially like when people went to work from home and it became a lot to manage. These VPNs, they weren't just site to site. I mean, they were, user to headquarters and having to have large concentrators and those sort of things. So all that to say, a lot of different point solutions out in the environment today that could be impacted. Anything to add to that, Adrian? I think it's so often we see that as an entry point.
Yeah, I mean, and especially that security point solution, right? Like depending on what kind of security you have already deployed across your network, the whole framework can really disrupt that if you're using a managed security service provider that is already managing some of those firewalls, but now may have to also be some type of conflicted responsibility with some type of SASE provider, right? So that's definitely something to be considering about.
Yeah. And then the next thing is where our next conversation almost always after that ends up in a place where we're talking to clients about, okay, their network access, what do they have today? The reason it ends up there is because oftentimes in the conversations we're having in private equity owned companies, it becomes a conversation of, hey, I want this stuff over here, right? I want these advanced features, but I'm budget constrained. What can I do? Like, where can I find savings? And we say, we look at the network. It's not always there, but it is a possibility for cost savings, mostly because it enables network underlay changes. So you can move from, possibly an MPLS network that was out there. We're seeing fewer and fewer of those, but an MPLS network that was out there, to something with dedicated internet access and broadband, or at times we've even seen people moving away from DIA to, broadband and mobility, and getting both of those things. It does pave the way for other core initiatives, looking at, things around edge compute, using 5G as a really truly viable access. In most places that isn't really there yet. Like, we don't advise clients on that as a primary, but that is coming, for sure. I think that's generally held as common knowledge. So you end up in a lot of considerations there. And then the next thing you have to think about is, okay, well, oftentimes you're moving from this traditional, potentially even MPLS network. You had one vendor that was managing and delivering all of that to you. And now you have different circuit providers, all over the place. You could do aggregation. If you don't do aggregation, you need to think internally about how you're going to manage that spend and those invoices, and how you're going to work with accounting to do it. There's a lot of kind of considerations in that area as well. And then finally, the team. So, not only are you potentially looking at, a project to undertake to do this, also, the way that the way your team is constructed today to manage and deliver and maintain the network infrastructure that you have, the security infrastructure that you have, may look different than it looks on the other side of a SASE deployment. And that's an area where potentially a lot of the business case is made. It's also an area where, a lot of what I'm advising clients on is, to really consider the knowledge, skills, and abilities of your team today. And I generally see this as being a net positive, when newer technologies are brought into companies, and some of the, some talent really, like, it helps retention, right? They want new, exciting things that they're working with, versus feeling like they're, maintaining a dinosaur, All right. So I think there's a lot of things at play there. You're giving them career opportunities, but do they want that? A lot of considerations.
Yeah, and a lot of people take that, team consideration and the knowledge, skills, and abilities, and they think, oh, well, we've been using Palo Alto firewalls for the last 10 years, so we really don't want to have to train anything new, because they're thinking about it from the complexity of existing systems. I think one of the things that we've seen very compelling is that as you start discussing this with different vendors, get a demo, get a legitimate demo followed by a proof of concept with a small deployment, because a lot of vendors will do that for free and you can see it firsthand, like, oh, a lot of these vendors aren't very complicated to manage when you're gaining the benefit of the security policies that are applied universally across your organization, instead of having to configure every firewall or update the firmware for every branch next-gen firewall that you have.
Yeah. And that, I mean, look, those things go into the business case, right? I mean, you're talking about, potentially monthly patching or however often, you're patching those, doing it individually at every site versus in a portal, essentially.
Yeah.
So, I mean, those types of things are very impactful to the team and ultimately weigh into the business model. The other thing though is, currently you may be doing this internally, or you may have it provided by a carrier or a third party currently. Oftentimes this is something where you have an opportunity to reassess that, and clients are asking, hey, do I want to be in the business of delivering a secure network? I need to be making sure that it's done. It's a core responsibility of IT, but as far as the staff and time it takes, is it better to do that with a third party? Is it what is the management support, or can you, take some of those lower level tasks and go into a co-managed type solution with a third party doing your basic triage, circuit management, that sort of thing. And then you potentially retain some of the, some of the more critical, engineers, and they're working on kind of higher tier priorities. So, the next place we end up in, though, after having that conversation about the areas that are impacted, is we generally end up in a current state assessment. And we've bucketed that into four main areas. But this can serve as a checklist. There's a lot of information together to really, once you're serious about walking down this road, that not only are impactful for, understanding technical requirements, all of these things also lay the groundwork for being able to build an accurate business case and have a successful implementation. Ultimately, all these things, you need to know them anyways to get to where you're going. We have found it's much better to do that and work through that and integrate it into the business case. So generally we're beginning with a current state assessment. Oftentimes, that starts with network information. So circuit inventories, all of the associated information with those, with those circuits, including the contract status, right? When you're building the business case, you start talking about what to do and when you can do it.
Especially that contract status. Yep.
And, we're talking about it here specific to the circuit inventory, but, it's actually the same thing on any of your point solutions that you have, as well as like the end of life dates on hardware, because you're looking for opportunities where, hey, I can start making steps towards this, right? You can build the business case holistically. And certainly sometimes there's a need to go in and just overhaul and transform, and run a project that way, but you're also looking for entry points. And so having that information about when your hardware is end of life, when your maintenance contracts are up, and the contract status on those things, it's vital information. You also have to have a site list by type. So you need to understand what's happening at that site. And I would add, really, especially what applications they're hosting and where those things are at. So whether it's, an individual user and you're building out profiles, or whether it's a branch office and you have different needs at different branch offices for accessing applications that are in different locations, you need to understand that, right? You need to essentially have a network topology, a network diagram. with the application layer available. I've found that to be pretty important in the things we're going to be talking about next that Adrian's going to go into. And then your user count. And most of this is based on work from home requirements. So most of these solutions have both cost components and implementation implications related to work from home users. So you want to understand what you're getting into there. Next would be performance baselining. So understanding where how this service, this function to the business that you are looking to potentially change or replace, how has it been performing? How has it been delivering to the business? Is this pain points or is it something that is status quo? You need to understand, is anything I'm going to do going to be revenue impacting, positively or negatively? And so understanding that through the context of performance baselining is very important. Also understanding, what's the cost of the business of downtime that has implications in planning for implementation, as well as in, costing of a solution, right? Ultimately, when you can build solutions that would result in no downtime ever, almost, with a very small almost. But it's not always, worth the investment to do that.
Absolutely.
You need to understand what the impact to the business is. And then a couple other things around kind of the typical timeline to deploy and some of those things. For staffing, we talked a little bit about that on the last slide, but you really want to understand what type of time these functions are taking of your team today. This is a space often, especially, in some of the network troubleshooting, some of the security type things that are shared hats or shared functions within a team. And so you need to understand, if it is a shared function, what percentage of time is it taking from that person today? Because there is likely something that is of higher value to the organization for those people to be doing than, network management, most likely.
And especially that to re-lens that, right, in the security conversation, even removing that out of SASE, right, just some type of monitoring on security solutioning is generally a lot better than one of your team having to check alerts and getting alert fatigue over a long period of time, right? Or just checking it, at 8 or 9 o'clock when they come in.
Yeah, as like their third job, maybe. That's not unheard of. Yeah, and then again, the knowledge, skills, and abilities, and the other piece I add there often, especially when I'm talking to IT leaders, is the career goals of your team. Right? You could have someone on your team that is looking at, forward technologies and certifications, and they're looking at opportunities in the market, and they, hopefully are someone that is a high performer and you want to retain. It is important in technology leadership to ensure that you are giving new opportunities, to your staff to continue their professional development. And so understanding what their career goals are there could be important. And then security information. You want to talk some about that, Adrian? Obviously, we have a framework we use. There's a lot of them out there, but you got to understand where you're at.
Yeah, and just like everything in security that we discuss, it's really based off of risk, and that trade-off between dollars, time, and the actual risk, because you're paying for that security product that is hopefully going to protect things and not be out of line with the cost of not having that and getting breached, right? So that the baseline risk also applies to compliance. If you have specific compliance requirements that are being met internally right now, that is like very, very important in the next slide in solutioning, because that's something that you should know and keep track of all the time in your current state. Any recent assessments are always great, because if they're already identifying critical vulnerabilities that can be solved by the technology solution that you're looking at in the SASE world, then that maybe is something that you cannot concern yourself with immediately, right? Like, we don't need to buy next gen firewalls and install them in every branch location if we are now going to be moving that to the cloud. So that type of consideration, and budget, new technology can be expensive, and the way that you design it can also be affected by your overall budget. So that's knowing what you have is an incredibly important part of that conversation.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing that's interesting about the budget part and knowing what you have in this context specifically is back to the previous slide where it impacts so many areas. There can be a lot of puts and takes, in this, because you're impact with this new technology, you're impacting older point solutions, you're impacting other initiatives that you can do. Like this business case specifically, is one where you want to review what was existing, through the lens of could this be impacted or not. And there's a lot of yeses when you kind of go down the list on that. All right. The next piece though, so you got a decent understanding for current state. You've used some framework, ours or someone else's, your own, to come up with a solid understanding for where you're at today. The next piece that we go into is, okay, well, like let's talk about where we're going and what the considerations are there. Adrian, this is your world. I know you're in these conversations all day, every day. You want to talk about this some?
Yeah, and very similarly to how you put it a couple slides ago with the considerations, in designing the solution, those are very similar considerations. So as you're doing your current state assessment, now you want to apply kind of that same framework to where you want to be in the future. And really that kind of breaks down into like equipment that you want on site, what kind of network it's going to look like, and your team or time that's going to be involved in that technology piece. So when you start breaking this down, you kind of separate things based off of the universal considerations that you're going to have to think about no matter what, and then break it down into the individual components of the SASE framework that you're going to use. And then kind of like we discussed a little earlier is the ancillary benefits of like using the Akamai or Cloudflare example for ZTNA. You can piecemeal some of these, but really at the end of the day, you want to determine what your desired components are going to be. Do you want those non-core components? Are they an essential part? And maybe do you need a core component maybe 2 years from now when your firewalls are out of like end of life and no longer have a requirement to maintain them from some type of service contract? But some of the other basic pieces, once you've got like where you want to be, is the number of sites and remote users that you have. Because when you're building this analysis of the business case in dollars and cents, the number of users comes into pricing models that you're going to be using from either vendors that are managing like an MSSP for any type of security services themselves that you maybe are currently using, but also the new vendor kind of consideration. So keeping that in mind as you build all this out. Do you want to implement this phased? No one really wants to do a digital transformation with everything right off the bat because it's really dangerous to the business. You incur a lot of risk. And really, at the end of the day, we are trying to support the business in generating that revenue. So phased being both component based of we only need component X right now, but it can also be like size of deployment. So you could just focus on bringing some type of full SASE capability to your core headquarters locations and bring all those systems on board, test them out, or even go low risk at first and choose one branch to do a test bed. And the management model, right? I mean, if you're going to try to piecemeal things together and do a non-managed SASE framework, then that's going to look a lot different than choosing and the considerations that you're going to use for a managed product. Application and service inventory has probably been hit on with the current state that we talked about last time, but also it's where do you want those to be? Are you planning on moving with some type of merger and acquisition? And as a result, you're going to be moving from Google to Outlook. I don't know, any type of additional pieces that's going to come into that consideration. And really the criticality of services. You really need to prioritize whether or not your VoIP system for your branch locations is a requirement. Because if your revenue is based off of that system, then that becomes very important. And maybe SD-WAN as a component is very important for you because you need the prioritization of that specific protocol. And it's kind of the availability of that, both the network, both like the services that I was just talking about with specific protocols, but also your overall network piece. So are you going to need to aggregate existing circuits that are coming in and ensure that you have failover, high availability, and we'll also go into the design of how many devices you need at each branch site. And hopefully your remote users don't have high availability, because then you're really relying on their home internet, but that's another consideration. And this is all something that we discuss with people during the initial consideration process and solution design process of our model. But then you get into network. I know Kyle hit on it a lot, but circuits, type number, existing SD-WAN capabilities, and desired SD-WAN capabilities. Kind of double tapping that availability specifically for network. And do you need WAN optimization? Because there are some services that are going to use and leverage their private backbones to ensure that you are getting faster than normal internet processing for any of your locations. And then that content delivery piece. Akamai Cloudflare, great example. I just came back from an Akamai conference. That's why it's on the top of my mind. But really leveraging that zero trust network access as part of that, it makes sense to migrate to that type of model instead of maybe a full SASE framework or a separate next-gen firewall from Palo Alto and the combination of those pieces. And near and dear to my heart, security considerations, existing services and firewall and hardware, and then desired. You want to go cloud, but is there a specific type of cloud service that you'd like to go to? Because you have a requirement on your existing firewalls. And so turning on like FortiSIM and some type of Forti SASE product is going to be a lot easier from a managed service provider if you have Fortinet firewalls already in place and have 3 years left on the contract. It's also kind of breaking it down into the desired firewall setup. With the cloud, you do have some capability to just have simple devices at each branch and no longer have to maintain that firewall at each branch. But you're also running into the same consideration of what you have on site right now and that service contract. And then that non-core, even adjacent services, EDR, MDR, SOC, SIM capabilities, do those integrate with either you have in place right now or what you'd like to migrate to on your roadmap? Do those integrate with the service and vendors that you are currently considering? So I know that's a lot. Well, it is a lot of acronym soup. There are a lot of considerations, but that's why these conversations are incredibly important to do upfront in the solution design, because then you really can focus all of your time on the vendors that are actually going to be able to provide that capability.
Yeah, for sure. And the thing is it's such an opportunity to start pulling in some of these. Like you're doing yourself a disservice if you don't spend the time really understanding across the broad spectrum. Seen a lot, multiple times we'll go into clients, and they've run down an initiative, and there's these other ones that were adjacent, and they went with a vendor that could have been able to be more in alignment with the future roadmap. And so, understanding that can really save you a little bit later, which I guess actually is a decent transition into TCO modeling, which is the next piece. But this is why we take this approach to it, because you can generally there's other approaches to basically conduct diligence on an investment in technology. The one that we think is most appropriate for this area specifically is TCO modeling. A couple reasons. One is you're moving from what may have been an asset to a service, right? So you're changing the way that you're procuring this thing, a thing or a whole suite of things. So not only is there kind of a financial modeling change as far as when you're incurring expenses, but also, if you can get some vendor consolidation, you're likely having much fewer vendors on the other side of this thing than on the first side, which changes your considerations there as well, right? You can't just compare a point solution versus SASE. You need to be looking at a holistic view, which is what we spent the last 2 slides talking about towards the future. And so a TCO model is generally accepted as providing a solid framework for that. Also, the other thing we like about it is it allows for a time element of phased deployment. So, Adrian talks a lot about finding that entry point, finding that thing that is a step towards this larger vision. Once you have it, understanding what that looks like and stepping that in with investments over time is an important part of this. So focusing a little bit, a TCO model has essentially cost and benefits. So focusing on the cost here a little bit on the right side of this slide, we generally are bucketing them in three very large areas, but the first being acquisition costs. Some of your variables here on kind of what goes into these are essentially, if you're choosing to self-deploy, like potentially you are still buying hardware, you could pull together a SASE, in effect, a SASE solution, procuring, deploying, configuring, managing, your network edge. You don't have to give up the management of it. It is possible to do that. But the acquisition cost of doing that versus as a service are going to look different. It also includes your project stand-up and deployment costs. So back to what I was just talking about, right? Doing it with, an as a service model, oftentimes they'll roll those in, or you're not really taking that upfront hit on the acquisition. You may be incurring it in the operating cost. Doing it internally, right? You may have to hire project teams. You may not. It's all a balance, right? As you look at those things. And then the other thing that we often see potentially gets overlooked is the billing overlaps. So as you have these solutions and you're trading them out, and there's a lot of puts and takes to this. Ensuring that you are accounting for overlap in billing or overlap in solutions. Obviously you do everything in your power to manage that effectively, but you do need to understand that there could be cost incurred there which should be considered acquisition cost.
Yeah, and like you were just talking about when, with my shout out, saying that entry point, when you are doing this modeling, it's important to also consider what the alternatives are in doing the ownership kind of computation of moving to SASE versus any other type of implementation. Because if you're leveraging the existing firewall replacement opportunity to move to a SASE framework, just keep that in mind, that those costs that are maybe universal for no matter how you do it, you are going to incur some type of new acquisition cost.
Yeah, and that's back to the TCO model, right? I mean, you're looking at multiple options, and that's where it starts to show up, because you're looking at these things that are already you're doing, right? Or you have to do, they're out there, and you're saying, okay, well, what is my alternative, and what are the other impact areas? Which is a good place to be, I think. The next would be operating costs, though, and so that's your monthly or yearly recurring. Think the vendor services that you're getting from this. Would be one component. You want to ensure that it's all of the components when you're conducting your essentially your course of action analysis, right? Because you can get stuck with just looking at a component part and not looking at the affected pieces, right? So you want to make sure you're building a holistic picture. And then it should also include your staff time assumptions that's for current state, right? Back to the current state assessment. Like any IT leader can actually benefit from ensuring they know where their staff is spending their time at. And it's often something that in day-to-day management gets overlooked. But understanding where they're spending their time at today and then in the future, right? So many of these systems, claim that the management time is much lower. That is generally what we have seen once it is deployed. That they are putting both physical and virtual hands on these items way less often. And then finally, the maintenance costs. So that's your admin staffing. So that can even include things like, in situation one, you've got a lot of vendors. In situation two, you have much fewer vendors, right? That's an area of impact, and you need to understand that, as well as also like ongoing training and, those sorts of things, and any difference between the systems. Anything to add on to that on just kind of cost components, Adrian? We good?
No, you hit it pretty well. That's, we do it for security as well. That this is not just a SASE thing. It's really because at the end of the day, you are a business, and we don't want to be a cost center. We want to be a revenue protector. So yeah, I think you hit it pretty well.
Pulling some of those things together, just in a very high level business case review of how we've seen it played out. I guess I would start with just some company highlights, and this one was picked for a reason. This type of company is a very, very solid fit for a SASE solution, right? So you're headquartered in US, but global operations, about 50 sites in year one, growing over time, right? That implies a lot of potential like deployment cost, configuration time. You're looking at what it costs to stand up 20 sites over the next few years with one means versus another.
Yeah.
You're looking at your global network performance and site to site things. Potentially, you're trying to get people who are out further and further to access the cloud and ensuring that that is securely accessed. So potentially even at this level, potentially even you have multiple cloud deployments that you're trying to tie together. So there's kind of a lot going on here. And then 1,500 remote users and growing. Right. So this is interesting, right? You're growing. Is it because of, and we've seen a lot of this over the last 3 years, is the remote user footprint growing because they're leaving offices? Is there opportunity where the business is looking and taking cost out of real estate, out of facilities, that a portion of could be reinvested to ensure that those remote users can actually securely access the network that they need to, the workloads that they need to. So it's kind of general company highlights. I'm not going to dive into the specifics around the numbers. They're kind of up there for consumption. I guess a couple pieces I'm going to go into. As far as the cost, we talked about most of those cost components on the previous slide. In this model, this was an as a service type model. So low initial cost. A lot of the vendor had included that over time in the contract type of thing. So low barrier to entry. The benefits I am going to talk a little bit about here, because there's essentially 3 core areas they came from. So the largest one was reduced operational and maintenance costs. So just the staff time that it was taking, the solutions that it was taking operationally in status quo versus the SASE deployment. About 63% of the assessed benefit came from there. The reduced time to configure and set up, so that's on the deployments. That was specifically looking at those additional 20 sites over the next few years. This solution to deliver a all component SASE solution essentially was taking about an hour to deploy, versus previously it would take an engineer about 20 hours of time working with that site to get that site stood up. And then the other savings from retired systems and hardware. So think of this as the hard cost components where you were spending money with a vendor or a solution, and you are now spending money with different vendor or different solution, and about 36% of the assessed benefit came from savings there. So there's a lot of places where these benefits come from to pull these business cases together and ultimately look at the ROI. But multiple studies have been released. Some transparently, some vendor funded, some from Gartner, those types of studies out there where this type of ROI on a project like this is not uncommon. And what we see is a lot of kind of adjacent benefits as well, and typically things that technology leaders are struggling with and looking for. Anything to add on this one, Adrian?
Yeah, that adjacent benefit is hard to quantify, but is something that should absolutely be considered, because the chance of misconfiguring services at a site that results in compromise capability from an adversary, right? Then you start getting into breach calculations too, right? So I mean, and that's, you can do a TCO for breach based off the number of hours that it comes to recover all that stuff. But as you start digging that further down, the reduced time for configuration and lack of mistake because of those universal security policies is hard to quantify, but which should certainly be a consideration.
Well, I mean, look, that's where some of the operational cost impact comes from too. This certainly isn't considerate of the risk side, but what it is considerate of is, even in year one, you have 50 sites, right? You've got to be patching, and managing those firewalls, like individually often, right? Someone on the staff is doing that, versus when you get, this type of cloud-based firewall, that you can remotely access and configure and push policies across all, it really does take the time down, like drastically. So, and then, taking that time down, back to your point, impacts compliance, right? The reality is, like, was there enough time in that person who was responsible for doing that? Like, was there enough time in the, like, just in the month for them to get it all? Maybe there was, maybe there wasn't. Maybe there was a fire burning somewhere. I've never heard of that happening in an IT department. And they didn't get to it. I think that's oftentimes the reality. All right. So I guess wrapping this thing up, I think we ran a little bit long. Apologies about that. Thankful to anyone that stayed on. We do have additional SASE resources all available at our website, curated by our own Mr. Josh Chorsey. So, a lot of great stuff there. And then I think, Josh, we've got another one coming up in the not too distant future, another series.
Yeah. Yeah, we're going to be leaning into some contact center demo centric series, getting specific on certain technologies that we're seeing adding a lot of business value as they're deployed, either as a full kind of rip and replace contact center solution or layering on to existing contact center solutions. So it's really another area that we're seeing our clients just reap a ton of value from, in strategically looking at kind of the benefits of a holistic cloud-based solution. So yeah, that is it for us. So I think the feedback has been great. So just want to encourage everybody to take the survey here at the end, and feel free to reach out to myself or Kyle or Adrian if you have any follow-on questions regarding SASE, how we can help if you're looking at converging your network and security. And I guess without further ado, I will sign off. So thanks again, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.